Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to those who've joined us today for this panel seminar hosted by RMIT University on the future of social housing. My name's Jago Dodson. I'm the Director of the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which RMIT conducts its business, the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present of those groups. RMIT also acknowledges that sovereignty was never ceded in Australia. The university also pays its respects to the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia on which the university conducts its business. So thanks for joining us this morning. It's an interesting moment in the housing sphere in Australia to be talking about social housing. There's a huge amount of debate currently in the public sphere around house prices, rental affordability, housing affordability, the role of interest rates in terms of household budgets and the cost of living, and an increasing attention to the fact that our social housing sector, which includes public housing, community housing and affordable housing, over the past few decades has suffered from a lack of policy interest, particularly at the federal level, but also at the state level to a varying degree, in terms of new stock development and policy and procedures. Some state jurisdictions are developing new policy frames for social housing, and currently in Victoria there's a significant program underway around models for new investment in social housing, how social housing, particularly community housing providers, are regulated and the tenant experience of that regulation, and development of new strategies over the longer term for social housing. We also have an election coming up in which I think it's fair to say that public, social and affordable housing has not yet had a prominent position in the debates that have been going on. Though I think if we look at the cost of living questions and some of the wider insecurities underpinning some of the debate around the election, we can see the spectre of housing looming in the background. So today we're going to have a panel session to discuss and debate the future of social housing, and I'm really delighted that we've been able to be joined by some eminent observers and researchers of social housing in Australia. The format today will be of some successive presentations from each of our panelists. They'll have about 10 minutes each to present on their views on the future of social housing in the contemporary context. Then we'll have some moderated Q&A that I'll lead with each of them to try and draw out some of the ideas or extend some of the conversation. And then we'll throw open the floor to the audience across Australia to put questions to our panelists and explore further the question. So without further deliberation, I'd like to introduce our speakers. I'll introduce them all right at the start, and then we'll just flick from one to the other as we move through the session. So first, we're joined today by Professor Hal Pawson, who is the Professor of Housing Research and Policy and an Associate Director at the City Futures Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. Hal's key interests include private rental housing, social and affordable housing and urban renewal. Before moving to UNSW, Hal had a long career based at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh in the UK, and therefore has an interesting perspective having worked both in the UK and Australia. Our second panellist will be Dr. Andrea Sharam from RMIT University. Andrea is a housing researcher with an interest in market-based apartment development, non-market housing models such as land trusts, cooperatives, non-profit housing and community housing. Andrea teaches on property in the not-for-profit sector within the School of Property Construction and Project Management at RMIT. Our next panellist will be David Kelly. Dr. David Kelly is a Vice-Chancellor's Research Fellow in the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT. He has a background in housing policy and public housing management, including a particular focus on the experience of tenants in public housing renewal programs. Our final panellist will be Associate Professor Selina Tually. Selina is a Deputy Director within the Centre for Social Impact at Flinders University. She's a geographer, social researcher and evaluator with experience in housing, homelessness and community development research spanning 20 years. Selina's expertise is co-designing and co-creating better programs, places and outcomes for disadvantaged and vulnerable people and communities. So we have a really terrific panel that you're going to hear from today. So I'd like to now invite Professor Hal Pawson to give the introductory presentation on the future of social housing. So over to you, Hal. And you appear to be on mute at this point, Hal.
Does that fix it?
That's working, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to present today, Jago, and thanks to RMIT for putting on the event. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in Sydney, which is Indigenous land, Aboriginal land never ceded. I'd just like to pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal people in the audience today. So the topic is the future of social housing, but I think we need to look at a bit at the past before we sort of get into that, or to frame that. So in this first presentation, I'm just starting by going back several decades, in fact, in the first slide anyway, just to remind ourselves where we've reached, where we've come from, where the social housing sector has, how the social housing sector has changed in its scale over the past 30 years. And you can measure this in various different ways. It's actually not correct to say that the social housing sector has been in decline numerically over time, even going back 30 years. It's been static, but the crucial, much more important than that, is the share of social housing of all dwellings, and also even more so the supply of lettings that are available from the sector, which has dropped by nearly half over that period in nominal terms, let alone proportionate to population. And at the same time, just looking back not quite so far, just 10 years or just over 10 years, you can see that sort of very static total size, and some gradual change at the national level in the composition of the sector. So Indigenous housing has remained more or less at the same size, and there's been a slight increase in community housing at the expense of public housing, some of which is former public housing handed over for management to community housing organisations, some of which is new development. But this is not a sort of common picture or universal story across the whole of Australia, and the makeup of the sector is hugely varied in different parts of Australia. From Tasmania, where it's mostly thanks to handover of former public housing, it's nearly half of all social housing. But in Victoria, for example, a much lower proportion. And without major public housing transfers, that really is very unlikely to change greatly over the next decade. It may be that there's significant development of new social housing in some states anyway over that time, and that might be predominantly community housing, but it won't make a big difference if that's the only game in town to those proportions. Looking forwards over the next few years, we're able to project the scale of new social housing development from some research that we published at the end of last year, which goes beyond anything that's published officially. These are the projections at the right-hand end of this sequence are indicating the national impact of the decisions by the Victorian government that Jago has already referred to, and 3 of the other 8 or other 7 other states and territories to announce state-funded social housing investment programs as part of COVID economic recovery. And that does indicate that there's going to be a modest but still, I think, quite significant spike in new social housing construction in certain states over the next 2, 3, 4 years. The impact of that, though, is going to be very different in different parts of the country. And this graph, also from that same research report, indicates or shows our estimates of the percentage point change that we should expect to see over that period in the size of the sector. So for Australia as a whole, despite that significant uptick in new development in certain states, we expect that the proportion of all housing that is social housing will still slightly decline across the whole of the country over that period by 0.07%. And the percentage, there will also be percentage point declines in New South Wales, Western Australia, South Australia, and the ACT, and also the NT. It's only in Tasmania where we'll see a significant increase in the proportionate share of social housing over that time. So to come on to some of the implications of this, firstly, it's very obvious, and nothing that I probably need to say to the people in this room, that the scale of provision has massively failed to keep pace with growing need. I think you could make a pretty good argument that the provision of social housing actually should be growing faster than population growth, not just equaling, which it's nowhere near doing, because the cohorts in the population who need that kind of help are expanding. The incidence of single parenthood, the numbers of people above pension age who are retiring without being homeowners, for example. So what we're seeing is that this is compounding declining tenancy turnover. That's one of the reasons why the drop in the supply, the lettings, social housing lettings every year is bigger than the stock reduction, because the turnover has been, basically the sector has been seizing up because exiting is extremely difficult. So that's has brought about increasingly strictly rationed allocation practice. The scope for promoting sort of mixed communities in social housing has been hugely reduced as a result of that. And I think that has implications for management intensity and the scope of tenant participation, which you could imagine that might be feasible. Those things are becoming more pressured, I'd say. Also, just to re-emphasize, the sector profile is extremely variable across Australia. So not all of these observations, are sort of equal for the country as a whole, or for every state. I think in the near future we are going to see this significant uptick in self-funded investment by certain states, but it won't be enough across the country as a whole to reverse the declining provision in proportion of all dwellings terms. I don't think there's any prospect that it's going to be enough, even in Victoria, to significantly absorb the backlog need, and the chance that many of us might think it would be desirable to broaden the scope of the tenant population. The scale of development that new development that we're expecting over the next few years is nowhere near enough to enable that to happen. Even if all new social housing development was in the community housing sector, public housing is going to remain dominant in most parts of the country. So secondly, just final two slides, just to talk about some implications around governance and regulation. And I think picking up on the fact that I think this seminar, as Jago mentioned, is particularly triggered by the Victorian Regulation Review. Statutory regulation of social housing is something that has been gradually or that has been in place, was established gradually during the 2000s, and it covers community housing, the community housing sector only. So it's only a quarter of all social housing. And the reason why this is, classically the justification for this is that it's a substitute for direct government control of a state-supported and to some extent funded service. And what it means is that regulated organisations have some oversight of their governance, financial viability, and service provision. And I think the sort of the classic justification for that is that this is giving comfort to key stakeholders in terms of governments, private finance providers and tenants. And I think the main motivation for putting this apparatus in place in Australia in the 2000s and the early 2010s has been mainly about enabling sector growth, has been mainly focused on providing comfort to private lenders who will be needed to offer good value debt to community housing providers looking to invest in expanding provision. And I think that's the community housing regulatory frameworks that we have now were put together, were structured on that basis. So the prime focus has been financial viability, not so much service provision or user engagement or tenant participation. In Victoria, as many of the people on the call will be aware, there's a new impetus for a more tenant-focused form of regulation, and therefore a greater emphasis on service provision, social landlord service provision. And I would say that logically implies a more intensive regulatory model that can't just be based on performance indicators and desktop reviews. It would need some form of service inspection. I think it's probably going to cost more to do that form of regulation, and we need to recognise that. I think if social housing service provision is to become the main regulatory focus, then it doesn't seem to make sense that we only focus on a quarter of the whole social housing sector, and the Victorian Independent Regulatory Review is envisaging or is proposing to recommend that a reformed regulatory framework in Victoria includes public housing as well, which is, I think, logical, but we do need to recognise that there would need to be a very a careful thought given to how you would adapt the current framework to do that. The design and the governance of it couldn't just simply be copied across. And I think these sort of observations also imply if you a tenant focused or a service provision emphasizing a dynamic in social housing, if that's the main, if that should be a bigger priority in the future than it has been in the past, then it's not just about affecting regulatory priorities, also government policy on other related matters like tendering criteria should be therefore prioritizing prioritizing management service quality to a greater extent. This is the report that we published at the end of last year, where the projections on social housing new investment are published, and this is the detailed table which will you can look at your leisure in relation to your own states. But I'm not going to take up more time now because other presenters must come on. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Hal, for that really terrific introductory presentation showing many of the issues that the public, social and affordable housing sector is facing in Australia, particularly the issue of decline and the mismatch between the level of stock and the level of need there is for social and affordable housing. Okay, and also thank you for being very timely with your presentation as well. So that's a great moment to lead into Andrea's presentation. So thank you, Andrea. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'd just like to also acknowledge the people, the Wairarung and Wairarung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we conduct our business today, and pay respect to the elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge Uhuri, who funded the research on which this presentation is based. And so my focus today is on asset management, and the first thing is to define what is meant by asset management. It's often confused with maintenance and repairs. Asset management is vastly more than that. It's a very systematic management of the physical assets, and the goal is to meet a specified level of service against standards in the most effective for present and future customers. Now, best practice asset management is user-centred provision. So in this case, the tenants should be at the centre of provision. And social housing is a very distinct asset subclass with very unique asset management challenges. And this is to give you an indication of how challenging that actually is. I think this is a hamburger with the red fields. It's about data in, and at the bottom about the range of decision making that has to be made in order to get to the meat. And that meat is about the creation of assets, the management of those assets over their life cycle, and then disposal, whether that's redevelopment or disposal. And again, another one to indicate just how complex asset management actually is. Asset management is not just something that an asset manager does. It has to have governance, buy-in. It has to be very integrated with both tenancy and financial management of the organisation. I thought I'd have a bit of a look at what have been sort of the old directions within the social housing sector. What we found through the research that we did is that the social housing sector is seriously constrained in its ability to maintain, renew and configure stock to meet current and future demand. That's not going to be news, I don't think, and certainly the major reason for that is the inadequate and failing social housing finance system that we have. So there's too little money going into the sector, and this has implications for growth. And as Hal has pointed out, the numbers might have stayed the same, but the need has grown dramatically. It also has huge implications for maintenance and renewal. And one of the results of this is a very substantial percentage of the housing is in not good shape. There's a lot of substandard housing in the social housing system. So those old directions. What we found was, the ownership, regulation, policy and financing are driving, very substantial differences in asset management practices and performances. And of course, one of these issues here is that the public housing system is not independently regulated. There's very little public accountability, and we have very little understanding for those of us outside those systems about performance. Community housing is regulated, but there are huge differences by state, by the size of the organisation, if it's registered at all, because not all states require that. And of course, there's the expertise and capacities of those state-based regulators. Of course, state housing authorities and government policies impact on community housing substantially, and it forms another level of regulation. This is around the lease conditions, around stock transfers, allocations policies, and of course ad hoc capital grant programs. But government policy, of course, obviously impacts on state housing authorities, and they have similar issues to deal with, such as allocations and the ad hoc nature of capital grants. But one thing that they have, which community housing doesn't, is because they have restrictions on borrowing, and this is just about government global borrowing restrictions, which is starving them of capital. What is interesting coming out of the community housing sector is their capacity to get private financing, to get debt, and they're often seeking to have long tenor debt, which is very sensible when you have a very long-lived asset. Is that exposes the financiers to the asset risk, and they are imposing market disciplines on community housing organisations. They have to demonstrate that they have very good asset management in place. A lot of community housing organisations are missing out on the kind of debt that they want because they don't actually have sufficiently good asset management. For the state housing authorities, their lack of access to debt leads to a lot of inefficiencies. It's putting a lot of emphasis on public-private partnerships, which those programs can be lack transparency, and they can be criticised for perhaps not delivering the kind of efficiencies that we want. It also means that those systems have to cannibalise their own stock. They've got lots of very substandard housing, so there is sell-offs in order to fund upgrades and renewals elsewhere in the system. We also found, of course, that there's a need for asset management skills across the sector. There's no specialised training and education, and that would make quite a lot of difference if that existed. What about some new directions? So these are provocations. I think we need a single and well-funded national independent regulator for all social housing. It's time that public housing came under external scrutiny, permanent external scrutiny. And as Hal said, the nature of the regulation would need to change. And it needs to be national because there's just too much risk of regulatory capture if they're state-based. We need to have a habitation standard. All organisations have to develop standards, levels of service. This one really stands out. Lots of the providers around Australia rely on residential tenancies. Now, in some states, it's very meagre what the habitation standards are, and this is resulting in a lot of housing which has structural defects and is, in a civilised sense, not particularly habitable, and it's particularly bad for Indigenous housing, and it's a breach of human rights. I think we need to see consolidation within the community housing sector. We literally have hundreds of organisations. We have many very small organisations. There's a lot of failure within that sector, and it's not regulated nearly to the same extent, but there are still a lot of assets and a lot of tenants that are subject to really what is the incapacity on a permanent level of these organisations to meet required standards. I think, if we have consolidation, I think we can think about having much fewer general leases. Let's just transfer the stock over to the community housing sector and let them manage it. We need allocations policy reform. The current allocations have driven, extreme rates of residualisation. Now, that has huge implications for tenants and communities, but it has huge implications for the organisations and their ability to financially manage. It really reduces the amount of cash flow they have, which in turn reduces the capacity to borrow. Community housing organisations are very lowly geared, and we can create bond aggregators and all of that sort of stuff, but organisations actually have to have the capacity to borrow in the first instance. So we need more money into the system to have good asset management. I think we need to be really thinking about the independence of the community housing sector. I think, the large ones, they've grown up. We should, as state governments, as the parents, should let them go. We shouldn't be trying to use other mechanisms besides the actual formal regulatory system to regulate them. So an example of that would be to remove directors' interests, which are put on titles when there's stock transfer. These things are about protecting the government interest. Well, we have housing acts and we have a regulatory system which does that. But these kinds of extra mechanisms actually adds considerable transaction costs and costs into the system, because those organisations need to be able to recycle their assets efficiently. And finally, state housing authorities, they need to have the powers to borrow. I mean, I know there's lots of political reasons and ideological reasons why they haven't had that, but I think they should. But it also raises the issues about, should we actually have public housing at all? Maybe we should be transferring all of the stock into the community housing sector and putting it all onto the one level and building up bigger, stronger, but a more diverse system. Thank you. And I think I've come in just on time, Jago.
Great, thanks very much, Andrea, and particularly for the detailed emphasis on the asset management and the regulatory aspects of social housing, which is sometimes an aspect of social housing that's often overlooked in kind of public debates about the need for greater stock. We need to be paying attention to all of these very detailed issues and reminding ourselves that housing is a physical asset as much as it's a social asset. As a physical asset, it has all these challenges around maintenance and management. Okay, so we will hand over now to David Kelly from RMIT to give his introductory presentation. So take it away, David.
Thanks, Jago. Can you see my slides all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thanks. So, hello everyone, my name is Dave Kelly. I'm a cultural geographer here at the Centre for Urban Research, and I just wanted to briefly kind of introduce my research trajectory, just because some of the provocations that I'm going to be introducing are coming from these perspectives of these certain experiences that happen within remote Aboriginal housing, disability accommodation, and so on. And it's coming from ethnographic data that I've collected over a number of years. And the thing that really set me up for performing this research was my experience as a graduate working in the Department of Housing in Western Australia. And what I observed whilst working there was a lack of regard for the tenant and a view from the department that it was a land developer first and foremost. This might not be the same sorts of mentalities that occur within other jurisdictions around Australia, but it certainly was whilst I was working in Western Australia. And so since then, I've had this long focus on the tenant experience of housing, but also dwelling policy, so those things that sit around housing policy in both Western Australia and Victoria. And so all the provocations that I'll offer here are from these particular research endeavours. And so what I've observed is probably what many in this virtual room have observed, and that is that housing precarity is worsening. Rental and mortgage stress is on the rise, displacement is becoming more regular, more people are becoming eligible for and registering for social housing, homelessness is increasing since COVID, but this isn't a supply issue, and nor is it a technical policy issue. And this is what I want to stress, that this is a social issue. But in policy, what we tend to do is completely avoid housing inequality, or the drivers of housing inequality. So think of those low-lying fruit like capital gains tax and negative gearing. Those things are off the agenda. And the current policy settings, let's say social mix-led urban renewal, they drive displacement, they reduce dwelling capacity in place, they increase inadequacy by reducing the amount of stock in the system for a period of time, they privatise public resources, and they homogenise diverse communities via gentrification. And what we're also seeing is that entry into social housing is becoming more conditional. With the nascent community housing industry, we see currently the current settings mean that they're preferencing tenants who have higher incomes and reduced amounts of social problems. So that's their preference. It might not be what happens across the sector in each individual organisation, but generally that's what happens. And I don't think research as it currently stands is doing anything to remedy this. I think the way research in this field is currently going, and many other fields, is that we have an obsession with seeking industry partnerships, which has serious implications for the type of material that we produce, the sorts of things that we inquire about. We constantly strive for policy impact, which means that we're reifying the terms set out by policy, and rather than looking outside. The constant push for innovation, whilst sounds great, this innovation must be sought within the narrow bounds of the current paradigm. So they're not your kind of paradigm shifting types of innovations. And I think that the bulk of this research means that it accepts the terms of the policy and avoids producing data that might undermine the home as profit model. So the overarching question that I tend to employ in my research, and this is not my question, but comes from Professor Tually up at the University of Sydney, which her question was, can there be good social policy? And I just kind of remolded this to be, can there be good housing policy, given that housing policy is social policy? And I think this is a useful question for both policy commentators and researchers, because the answer is at once yes and no, and it's neither. So it's social. It begs us to ask further questions about for whom is it good and for whom is it bad. I think if you ask people who have found themselves in that growing, expanding category of a precarious dweller, be it renter or social housing tenant, they would say housing policy is bad. And then those who are kind of reaping the benefits of negative gearing would say that the current settings are good. So it's really a contextual question. And the second question, again, not my question, comes from Peter Marcusa, which is the benevolent state a myth? So is the state best placed to enact good housing policy? And who does the state serve when making housing policy and for what purpose? So I think that if we really interrogate the current trajectory of housing policy and ask who gets the windfall from all this, it's less and less likely to be a precarious renter and more likely to be someone who sits within the private sector or the free market. And more specifically for my work, which is less concerned, if you can already tell, with the black letter content of policy and those sort of statistical analyses or population level analyses. But what I'm really interested in is, what does policy do to people who are at the frontier of its implementation? So in Victoria, we had the Social Housing Regulation Review, and that was clear in saying that the well-being of current tenants will have to be sacrificed as housing policy progresses. So as housing policy is a social issue, the question I ask is, are we socially comfortable with these well-being trade-offs for precariously housed people? And these trade-offs include mental and emotional stress, financial hardship, loss of community, locational disadvantage, and deleterious health effects. So more pointedly, the question that I'm asking is, who has the power to make the change here? And this is another question that I think a lot of housing research internationally is asking. And if the change brought by housing authorities amplifies the trade-offs, that amplifies the negative effects of being relocated or displaced, then the benevolent state is a bit of a myth in this space. So policymakers, time and time again, we find, need to be compelled to make better policy. And this is a really uncomfortable reality for most people and policymakers, researchers, whatever, because that means that the tenant voice is best placed to bring about housing justice rather than the sorts of data and information that we produce. So in speaking to the brief of the symposium, how can agencies and governments better draw on the tenant experiences or perspectives in the management and governance of social housing? Now, going back again to the Victorian Social Housing Regs Review, that prioritizes policy change to establish and enhance what they're terming the consultation infrastructure with tenants. So essentially what it's doing is recommending a reattunement to the tenant experience. But the implicit connotation here in this formulation is that the tenant voice doesn't currently exist. And now I've been writing about the tenant voice for a few years now, but the problem is not that tenants don't have a voice. It's that what they're saying challenges the non-negotiable aspects of housing policy. So tenants organize themselves, and what they need are the resources to continue that work and a policy of non-interference. So this includes unconditional access to resources to re-establish resident associations on estates, access to and control of community spaces, direct democratic participation in representative bodies, as well as independent avenues to register complaints. So in Victoria, there's been this ongoing resident-led campaign to establish a public housing ombudsman. And this is largely due to the current process of complaint, whereby tenants are ritually required to rehearse their own trauma to bureaucrats and workers who have no capacity to action them. So residents are asked to perform their anguish, but are refused respite. And it's becoming more Kafkaesque as we delegate the role of social landlord to non-state actors who shelter the state from complaint, but have fewer legal responsibilities to consider the rights and well-being of tenants. And another major process that diminishes the voice of tenants is this nationwide and indeed an international process of public housing renewal. So through this process, tenants are spatially dispersed around the city. And from this tenant activist perspective, the most destructive thing for organising a community to register a collective complaint is non-proximity to one's community. So this, coupled with the fear of retribution via relocation, or to be forced into a formal system of complaint that has no capacity to act, these are the primary drivers of a diminished tenant voice. So if housing policy of the future really wants to foreground this tenant voice, then it needs to do a few things, and that is keep communities together, resource their organising efforts, establish a non-partisan avenue of complaint, and I think a major one here is build more public housing. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, David, and it's a really valuable perspective to bring to this conversation around the tenant experience and the work that you've done in relation to that. So thank you. Okay, we'll move on to Selina Tually now. So I don't believe Selina's got slides. So over to you, Selina.
Thanks, Jago, and thanks everyone for the invitation to present today. I am on what was and always will be Ghana land here in not so sunny Adelaide today. I'm taking a slightly different tact, I guess, because I'm talking about South Australian perspectives, and so I thought I'd go a little bit higher up and just sort of track through where we're at in South Australia in terms of social housing. So we had an election about 5 weeks ago, which resulted in a change of government, ousting a first-term government here after 16 years of a prior Labor government. So everything's in a little bit of, I think, what could be best described as flux at the moment. So what that has meant really in many ways is that 4 years of policy making and reform and change under a first-term government has now kind of ground to a bit of a halt, or at least we're making a number of assumptions about where we're at in terms of social housing policy in South Australia. So, and backing up a lot of what Hal said around how different the landscapes are in terms of the social housing sector nationally. We sit here often wishing we were Victoria with the massive investment that, at least from the outside, it looks like you're going to get in social housing. So what I thought I would do is actually give you a little bit of a rundown on what the housing policy and homelessness policy looked like from the last election, which really was extremely minimal from both sides and probably reflects where we're at in terms of the national conversation around housing policy. It's a little bit surprising that it's not anywhere near in focus to the extent that many of us would expect. And I think the other reason to note that is that, you know, at least, and I'm not suggesting that South Australia is the centre of the universe, because it's certainly not, but there's been some suggestions from political commentators that, you know, maybe the South Australian election result is a bit of a warning for the national scene. So, you know, anyway, so basically the Labor Party that was recently elected has released a public housing and homelessness support plan, which includes money for 300 new homes. That's right, 300. 50 of them in a common ground style development in the inner city, 50. We have at least 200 people rough sleeping on the streets in the city at the moment, and it's an increasing number of people. 350 untenantable homes, coming to Andrea's point about habitation and the poor quality of stock, are to receive major works of $80,000 on each property, again 350, so that's 750 new-ish properties into the system. And there's going to be a maintenance blitz of about $7,500 in value to 3,000 homes. We've had a massive problem with an ageing, poor quality housing stock in South Australia for a very long time. The South Australian Housing Trust was obviously a really important structure in the development of this state, but we still have some stock that is over 100 years old in the public housing bucket. And so, you know, quality, location, suitability for a whole range of things is a real challenge with quite a proportion of our stock. And like many other social housing systems in Australia, we have a lot of stock that is 3 or more bedrooms, mostly 3 bedrooms, with demand for 2 bedrooms and 4+ bedrooms. So we have that absolute mismatch in our stock as well. And then the second part of that new policy platform is some support for people experiencing homelessness. Our state housing authorities actually really intimately involved in an End Homelessness campaign here. And so we've had quite a lot of reform around collaboration, etc., which I'll come back to later in terms of governance. That has caused some political challenges around the place. So part of the sort of support for people experiencing homelessness is money for wraparound support for that common ground facility, and then some money to 3 major services in the city that were defunded as part of a reform process, and then also a discharge support service from the hospital to try and avoid that sort of presentation of homeless people to the emergency department. The assumed part of what's going on here is that the state housing plan continues in full effect. The state housing plan was reworked in 2020, and so we have a 10-year strategy now that actually for the first time integrates social or housing broadly, including social housing, obviously, homelessness and support. Which I think is a good thing because the support element of the conversation often gets left out. That plan, though, from my perspective, probably has a little bit too much focus on affordable housing at the expense of social housing. So, you know, we talk about 20,000 affordable housing properties over the 10-year period from 2020 to 2030. The vast majority of that is affordable and not social housing. So we're not really talking about an increase in social housing stock here at all, which kind of fits with Hal's graph, which is a little bit depressing, Hal, about even more reduction in our stock. We've been selling off stock in South Australia for a really long time now because apparently having 10% of your housing market as social housing stock was a bad thing. So we decided to try and make that 5% instead. So the sector here has very much gone through the transfer process. So we now have about 25% of our social stock in the community sector. And there's definitely some promise in terms of leverage and redevelopment that is improving the quality of stock. But just to give you an idea, 5,000 transfers, they're expecting kind of 1,000 extra properties out of the leverage side of that. So we're still not talking about a lot of increase in property numbers, and a waiting list that's 16,000, although they did whack some people off the waiting list by removing one category of need. That was probably because those people were never going to get houses. So the suitability of stock remains a real issue. There is a bit of a focus on improving the efficiency of some of that stock. There's talk of strategic divestment. Not quite sure what the plan looks like for that though, and even less sure now that we've got a change of government. We do finally have a single housing register in South Australia, which probably surprises a lot of people across the country, but it's a conversation we've been involved in for about 20 years. That's a bit of a work in progress and is causing some issues when you talk to the community housing sector around, you know, prioritisation, categories, who you can take, who you can put in what properties. The other weirdness that I think we have in South Australia that may or may not be the case everywhere else is title deeds to properties tend to specify in a lot of cases the needs group that can be put into that house. And so, you know, you might get a house that pops up in terms of availability, but it has to be allocated to an ex-prisoner or an Aboriginal family or whatever. So there's all of these there's a matrix of how you have to allocate houses that's a little bit complex in South Australia as well. I guess the kind of key thing that I wanted to talk about really was some of the reforms that we've done and or the state has engaged in over the last little while. Again, a little unclear about how this is all going to go forward, but basically over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work to reform the specialist homelessness services sector in South Australia. That's been driven by our state housing authority, and the underpinning ideology for those reforms has been to force greater collaboration between services to improve outcomes for clients, and then the system as a whole. So what we have now in South Australia is a situation where we defunded all of our specialist homelessness services about a year ago. Everybody had to then regroup into alliances, which is a completely new structure for South Australia, and was quite a journey and conversation, and remains so. And so basically we now have 4 regionally based alliances across the state, and then 1 statewide domestic and family violence alliance. Those alliances work as genuine partnerships. So the Housing Authority is around the table as an equal partner with a whole range of specialist homelessness services in each of those arrangements. That, you know, it's a sort of try, test and learn model in many ways as we go forward. So basically we have conversations now emerging about whether housing allocations can be more actively kind of tied into those alliance structures as well. The bit that's probably missing, and is a bit of an oversight that hopefully will be rectified over time, is actually the community housing sector's role in those alliances. Given that, you know, 25% of the stock sits with the community housing sector, there's obviously a conversation that needs to be had there around their role in those sort of governance structures. The alliances have created a whole range of governance levels and groups, sort of at a senior manager level and an executive level. There's a lot of governance work in that structure. What it has also achieved so far is some really beneficial conversations about data sharing, shared goals, and now some work around an outcomes framework for the whole specialist homelessness services system. And obviously that has great intersections with the public housing system, and hopefully will with the community housing system as well, in terms of prioritisation of particular groups of people, etc., for housing allocations. So that all of those changes are aligned to sort of housing first, safety first, and also cultural safety work in South Australia. We have a significant proportion of people in housing need are Aboriginal in this state, and then we have interesting challenges around remote visitor movements across South Australia and from the Northern Territory into South Australia as well, which cause challenges for our system, which is really culturally inappropriate when it comes to housing Aboriginal families, and also kinship groups that, you know, come in and out of dwellings and tenancies and all sorts of things. We also have an Aboriginal housing strategy for the first time in quite some time. They disbanded our Aboriginal Housing Authority in the early 2000s, I think now, and just rolled all of that housing into the sort of general social housing bucket. I think they're trying to sort of, or they were, at least under the previous government, trying to sort of rectify that situation a little bit to give a greater voice to Aboriginal issues, a greater focus on culturally safe housing options. That there's been some challenges with that in terms of the right governance processes and the right people filling roles, and also just extremely overstretched staff trying to do sort of culturally safe work, particularly around remote visitors. We've also had a little bit of stuff, and I hate to use the term innovation after David just mentioned, you know, innovation being a kind of one of those terms that's used probably a little bit incorrectly at times. We've also had commitment to a homelessness prevention fund to try and turn the tap off. That's kind of stalled a little bit, and it's tied up into some politics, I think, in terms of the new government as well. Hopefully, I mean, the conversation around that is, so there was actually a release of money, and then they didn't actually fulfill some of the tender because the collaboration wasn't quite right. So they're really trying to get broader collaboration than just the specialist homelessness sector in that turning off the tap conversation, you know, so into those areas where we know there's sort of inflows into homelessness and then you need that specialist tenancy support for tenancies to actually succeed. So yeah, there's an ongoing conversation there. The other thing that is genuinely happening in South Australia, although very small scale and probably quite slow, is lived experience involvement in or lived experience voice in service delivery. It's referenced all through the state housing plan, and there's been a funding of a lived experience engagement service, which is delivered by a specialist homelessness service. It also involves 2 reference groups, an Aboriginal one and a general reference group, and that's kind of a bit of an accountability mechanism in terms of lived experience voice and also advocacy, and is a forum for holding some of the reform process to account as well, because we have had some issues with some of it related to COVID as well. We've had some issues with the sector being very overstretched in the transition period to the new alliance structures rolling out on the ground. And so there's some work being done there with genuine lived experience engagement to hold the system to account and actually understand what client journeys through that system look like. Sort of alongside that is some other work that we have this small scale lived experience advocacy network who are doing a project funded with ILC money, disability money, around lived experience governance and leadership. And that's really with a view to being able to build the right structures to support people with lived experience on boards, and in those kind of roles where governance roles where, you know, we know a lived experience voice is needed. And some of that conversation is about peer support roles, but it's also about genuinely using some of the assets in the staff of certain organisations who have lived experience of those journeys and are willing to put forward that voice. I'm involved in an evaluation of some of that work, and it's really interesting work, and there is a genuine want among some people with lived experience to actually use their voice to really make those kind of policy level changes and some of those program level changes. But as David pointed out, sometimes those voices are sort of stifled because, you know, they don't fit with what policy directions say. I guess the other reflections I would have around sort of the future of the sector, and some of these very much fit with what David was saying as well. Some of the other work that we've been doing for Huri over the last few years around tenant voice really suggests that in terms of the management of social housing and sort of governance, we're not paying enough attention to what our tenants need and are saying about their experiences of the system. And, you know, we know what some of those issues are. They're neighbourhood issues. There are a whole range of things around antisocial behaviour, but also around just inappropriate housing and most importantly, in some ways, connection to community and services and those things that people really need to be able to feel part of a community, and also to sustain their accommodation longer term. So I always have this argument with the executive director of the housing authority here about whether our housing authority is a generalist or a specialist housing provider. And I think they're a specialist housing provider because they have tenants that have particular needs, but we're not in the support conversation in South Australia at all. And I don't think that you can just provide housing, as in tenancy, without really having some level of involvement in the support side of things, or at least some mechanisms in place to ensure the support stays in place to the extent that's needed. So that sort of tenancy support plus, I call it, side of things, I think is really an area where we need a greater level of focus. I guess, you know, each state does things a little differently, but there's definitely some things that we could reinvigorate at the national level that would make things better. I was talking to a senior executive not that long ago in the Housing Authority who pointed out that when we moved to the whole COVID emergency management landscape, we dropped some of the national structures that brought together some of the senior executives from state governments to just talk through you know, what policies were looking like in the housing landscape and those kind of things. And I think it's time that we returned to some of those groups being back in existence. We look to Victoria a lot in South Australia, you know, particularly in terms of some of the residential tenancies work and those kind of things. So I think those opportunities for sharing really matter, and it's a little strange at times that we do things in such silos at a state level, and that's obviously what a national approach and a national plan could really help to sort of break some of that down, I think. But yeah, that's probably where I'll leave it so that we can get into some broader questions.
On mute. Thank you very much, Selina. Really great to hear that detailed overview of the South Australian experience and in a moment of potential change as well. Okay, so we've got a bit of time for a conversation amongst the panelists. One thing I wanted to do is pick up on something that Hal mentioned around the role of the regulated housing provider organisations as a substitute for state government services, and the kind of tension that is generated in the system when you move from having a kind of a single provider, state managed provider, to multiple, somewhat, but not necessarily client orientated providers in terms of targeting a particular client cohort. Where is the balance in the panel's view across that question of singular centralised management versus more distributed, potentially fragmented management that may also potentially provide the greater focus on specific needs of client cohorts? Does anyone want to have a stab at that?
Jago, are you talking about a single versus a fragmented management of social housing, or a single versus fragmented management of regulation of social housing?
Firstly, the fragmented, I guess, or decentralised institutional model, where we've seen over the last couple of decades a shift from, you know, the single housing authority to much more emphasis on the community housing sector. But then, because of the fragmentation in that sector, each organisation is potentially targeting a different client group, but also applying its own policies and procedures within that environment.
They have very little. They have very little scope to do that. I mean, I think that's a bit of a myth, actually. State governments, maybe not in every jurisdiction, but certainly in the big jurisdictions, are pretty prescriptive about requirements for not-for-profits, for community housing organisations to operate common policies with each other and with the public housing system, for particularly, well, on things like allocation priorities, especially. I mean, the idea that there's you know, this way the system has gone has opened up the scope for lots of cherry picking by the, you know, the non-government providers. It's highly exaggerated. I mean, I think there may be many arguments, valid arguments, that say that, you know, there are disadvantages of that direction that we've been going in, but that is not one of them.
Thanks, Hal. Does anyone else want to comment on that question?
Not so much on the regulation side of it, but I think the challenge that is raised around the place here with that and the sort of transfer issue is more the systems behind it. So you end up with, you know, the state housing authority has, you know, however many thousand properties in South Australia, 40,000 or whatever it is. And then, you know, we've got a number of tier one providers here who have, you know, portfolios of 5, 6, whatever thousand. But the systems that they have to collect data, to, you know, monitor what they're doing in terms of asset management and all of those other things are very much their own responsibility. They don't necessarily talk to other systems. It's very hard then to work out the performance of each of those individual organisations against, you know, the whole system. And so there's sort of this ICT/data systems issue that is a real challenge at this end.
Okay, thanks, Selina. Andrea or David want to comment on this? Go ahead, David. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
Just in the Victorian context, just to address the cherry picking point, because it is a sticky point. I mean, everyone who's on one side argues one thing, everyone on the other side argues the opposite. In Victoria, we don't know. So this is part of the problem, that we often hear this touted figure that community housing providers have to take 75% of their allocations from the Victorian Housing Register. But then when you talk to community housing providers, they say, oh no, we have a participation agreement with the state government, with the VHR, like, you know, we don't have to take 75%, and some of them take much less. So 75% might be the standard, but it's not the rule. Like, there's radical difference around allocations across the sector, and they're all individually tailored to the needs of each individual CHP. So we don't know whether or not there's wide-scale cherry picking, and part of the problem is you can't get the data where you can, like, you can't FOI a community housing provider. This is another issue with transparency and accountability.
Yeah,
I mean, could I just come back on that? I mean, you're absolutely right, David, that there's a shocking lack of transparency in, you know, across this whole sector. You know, we've got the community housing regulation system set up in all jurisdictions, 3 separate systems, but nevertheless they have a lot of similarities. But they generate very, very little published data, as you say, about community housing provider practice. And as Andrea said, we know even less about the performance of state and territory. So yeah, that is all a big problem, a cultural problem about concealment of what should be publicly available information. But there is all we do have that gives us a tiny insight into this issue that you're raising here is that from the AIHW, who do publish annually stats on the proportion of lettings by public housing and by community housing in each jurisdiction, which are non-priority or priority applicants. That is the only source we have to go on. It's very broad brush, but from that very broad brush source, we see no evidence that there's a difference, that there's a far, let's say, a lower proportion of tenants being housed by not-for-profits who are greatest need applicants. There's no sign of that at all, even in Victoria.
Yeah, I might go to Andrea. I think you had a comment, Andrea.
Look, I totally agree on the accountability, transparency issue. It's huge, but the cherry picking argument, it highlights. I think the question we need to ask is why is this a debate? Why is this an issue? And it's because state housing authorities are trying to enforce their own current operational, logic onto community housing, because why do community housing resist? It's because they have to. The state housing authorities are starved of funding, and so the states created a community housing sector so that private finance could come in, but then they undermine the conditions by which that happens. If you don't allow community housing organisations to choose the tenants in order to deliver the revenues they need, in order to have the free cash flow to service loans, then they will not get loans. They will not be getting the kind of private financing, which is, a really big part of the reason why governments have wanted that sector to exist in the first place. So it's this, we're running 2 systems with some grey area in between, which is the general leases. We need to have a wholesale look at what is the purpose of the systems and how do you regulate it to deliver the outcomes that you want to have.
Andrea, thanks for that. I might use that as a segue to something that you mentioned in your presentation, which was around the question of whether we need a national regulator for social housing. If we look to, say, the private lending sector, we have various regulatory agencies that oversee the credit system, including APRA and others, which pay a lot of attention to housing, given the significance of mortgages to financial stability. Obviously, social and community housing, affordable housing, tends to be provided by state agencies rather than private or quasi-private agencies. But what might a national regulator look like for social housing? How could that operate?
Well, we've got an entity which calls itself the National Regulatory Scheme for Community Housing, but it's a misnomer because it in fact doesn't cover two important states. Victoria and WA have their own systems, and the proposals of the independent regulatory review for the regulatory system in Victoria are really envisaging greater detachment from the national system, which I think is an extremely regrettable step if that's what happens. I mean, I'm not objecting to the kind of priorities that the independent review is advocating. They're mostly they're things which I completely agree with, but what we need to see is priorities like that influencing a national scheme that that covers the whole country, partly for the reasons that Andrea has mentioned around resisting regulatory capture by the states, by individual states and territories, especially the idea that you can regulate public housing systems with entities which are specific to each individual state which you're trying to regulate the public housing in. I just what authority would they have to do that? I'm not talking about legal authority because that's a tricky thing anyway in this country because of the federal system, but I'm talking about what moral and expert authority would they have? So I completely agree with Andrea's argument that that's a very important justification for advocating a national system with a which has a federal government buy-in. That's what the so-called national regulatory system which has existed now for most of the last decade, that's what it's completely lacked. The federal government just turned its back on it completely in 2014 and has never reviewed that. So I think that's important. It's partly about the need to resist regulatory capture by individual states. It's also about the need to think about pooling expertise and authority, which I think comes with a system which is above the level of the jurisdictions.
Andrea, Selina, or David, did you want to comment on that?
It's definitely a reflection of our federal system. My understanding is that in Victoria, the notion of going it alone wasn't the first, wasn't what they actually decided to do. But how do you join a national system that's not really a national system of where there doesn't seem to be really any ownership of it at all?
Yeah, I can't see it happening under the current government. I'm sorry to say. Let's put it out there. I mean, there's just no sign. There's no sign of there hasn't been any sign since 2014 that the Commonwealth has any interest in this. So for as long as that's the case, I think we're stuck in the fragmented system that we have, and if Victoria wants to enhance its system, its regulatory system, and put more resource into it, then it will do so without without that spreading across to the other jurisdictions.
And so the result for Victoria would be a need in order to prevent that regulatory capture and to develop independent expertise. We'd have to break up the public housing system in order to achieve that end. That, to me, would be the only conceivable route to it.
Okay, thanks for those thoughts. I'll ask one more question of the panel, sort of combine a couple of thoughts that came up in David and Selina's presentation. David mentioned the idea of a consultative infrastructure, how you actually do the consultation with tenants, and Selina touched on those issues as well, but also brought in the perspective of Indigenous housing and cultural safety work and the procedures and the stock management and so forth. I guess a question to the two of you and Andrea and Hal as well would be, what is an appropriate consultative infrastructure? How do you design it, and how do you ensure that it can incorporate diverse voices, but also specifically First Nations voices, which, as you've identified, Selina, have a particular set of needs and relationships that they bring to housing? David, do you want to kick off first, or?
Sure. I'm not sure how to design an effective consultation infrastructure. All I know is that the one that exists is not working very well. Just like an anecdote from when I worked at the Department of Housing, I was up in the Kimberley. I went out to a community named Luma in kind of central west Kimberley, and when we arrived there, we had a town meeting, and the discussion that we were bringing was your rents are going up, which was then greeted by a bunch of angry people, who then my job as the graduate was to list off complaints with their housing. And that just got written down on a piece of paper. We went off back to Perth, and that never got looked at again. All of their complaints were just put away. And that's how the whole consultation infrastructure worked in the Kimberley region, WA. Forward 4 or 5 years and looking at housing renewal in Victoria, you get told you're moving out, and that's the consultation. The consultation will follow from there. Your estate's been renewed, and we will be back in due course. But that's the alert. The alert is you're moving out, and then they just walk away. And this happened to a community in Port Melbourne 2 weeks before Christmas. And then they had to sit with it until February before the government came back to them. Like the mental anguish that does to a community is just disgusting. So I don't know what it looks like, but I know what it doesn't look like. And more tenant involvement would definitely be a good thing, but there is no infrastructure that the state recognises on estates. They don't recognise tenant bodies on estates in the way that we think they do. Like yes, all right, some estates do have resident associations, but majority of them don't, and they're extremely hard to get back up the ground once they're gone. So I think that's one way is resident associations.
Thanks, David. Selina, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, a bit like David, I don't know what that consultative infrastructure would look like either in some ways. I mean, again, I know what some of the elements shouldn't look like, and I think David's done a pretty good job of summarising some of those. I mean, these are the things that do keep me awake at night, to be honest, these kind of questions. I think in some ways, and this doesn't sit well with governments, but in some ways, it's a case of you have to jump in and start trying something because everything else we're doing is not working well, right? And so we do it in a step-by-step way. We recognise that we're going to have to learn some hard lessons over time about meaningful representation of lived experience, tenant voices, the value that we ascribe to those voices and what that looks like, and some uncomfortableness for the system about where things are not being done well. Stock divestment is one area that, we could learn a lot, etc. In terms of the cultural side of it, very small scale example, but we just stood up in South Australia before Christmas for a couple of months, a very intensive Parklands response to our remote visitor issue. And it ended up with a whole range of different kind of stakeholders and the usual stakeholders working extremely collaboratively to keep people safe in the inner city who, let's face it, could at any point in time have, violence could have kicked off and did kick off, or could have been hit by cars or all sorts of things. Like, a lot of these people were Northern Territory type people who were down here for a whole range of reasons. And so that model, though, had a cultural governance framework of sorts. It wasn't easy because Ghana elders and APY lands and cross-border community elders, etc., have different ideas around things, and it wasn't at all easy, but it was extremely relational, and there's a lot that can be learnt from those kind of small-scale initiatives around relationship building, how you manage tension between community, obligation, and a whole range of other things. So I think there's some structures out there that we can start to learn from. And, one of those in the South Australian context is the Lived Experience Advocacy Network, who have a group of people already who, have experiences of poor, poor experiences of the housing system and the medical system and the mental health system, a whole range of other things. And you can start to bring together some of the perspectives into tools or approaches or forums or those kind, but it's a long conversation.
Okay, thanks, Selina. Look, I know Hal has to go, so Hal, just drop off as you need to, and we'd like to thank you for your participation today and for your presentation as well. So much appreciated. We might move to some of the audience question and answers. There was a question about Indigenous perspectives, but I think we've partly covered that in the last part of the conversation. So I might move on to the same questioner who's got another question on, with the rise of the build-to-rent housing market, how do the panel expect this to impact social and affordable housing in Australia? Who'd like to tackle build-to-rent?
I'm happy to do that. It's actually not likely to have hardly any impact at all. The build-to-rent is market housing, and a good part of it's aimed at well above the low income. It could, if there were a subsidy system going into it, which is what occurs in the US. But we've had no indication from, and ideally that would be a Commonwealth program. No indication of them moving that way. We had NRAS, which was a version of the low income tax housing credit in the US, but we just don't have anything. But I have had build-to-rent proponents or financiers actually saying that that they're seeing a diversity of build-to-rent aimed at different income cohorts, and I think that's really interesting that they're moving down the income spectrum. But the proof will be in the pudding.
Thanks, Andrea. Anyone else want to tackle build-to-rent?
I'm no expert in build-to-rent whatsoever, but I'm curious whether or not this signals a new market where community housing providers and private investment funds and those sorts of actors and super funds play a big role. We're seeing in Victoria a recent announcement that Housing First have partnered with a private investment fund to do a build-to-rent model where the private investment fund fronts some capital and gets the dwellings back after a number of years, but also collects market rent for the head lease. The government pay subsidy into that deal, so on paper the only winner there is the private investment fund. The public purse is leaking money, and the community housing provider, yes, just manages the tenancies for I don't know how long it was, maybe 10 or 15 years. So that to me seems like a new market completely, where we're still paying public subsidy, but the profit motive is there, present, and still existing. So that's where I kind of see the build-to-rent model working in that space a little bit.
Great, thanks, David. Might move on to another question from the audience, which is waiting for the questions to load in front of me. Someone has asked, Andrea, have you seen any good examples of a habitation standard?
Look, that's a very good question, because actually it's an incredibly complex thing to do. And it's the incredible level of detail that may need to go into it. And it's one of my colleagues who ran this asset management for Housing New Zealand saying, oh, it gets down to things like, should the stove have one hob or not? Do you say it should have 4 hobs? And therein lays the problem. But we certainly have to have a habitation standard that says there should be no structural defects. The sewerage should be connected, and these are the kind of problems that actually do exist within our system. So we can lift the bottom without necessarily being hugely prescriptive. But we need to be thinking about it. But these are the kind of conversations that just simply, they're absent, completely absent. You know, what standard should we have that our tenants, you know, should have as a service?
Thanks, Andrea. Selina, did you have any thoughts on that?
I guess the only thing I would add to that reinforces the complexity point. So, you know, if we think about our remote Aboriginal communities in South Australia, where it can get to 55 degrees for, you know, quite a proportion of the year, and hence why a lot of people come down to Adelaide, the standard around habitation looks very different to the standard in some of Victoria, for example, where that might not be the case. So it's an extremely complex thing to specify across a diverse geography of Australia. But there is some, I mean, there's some great work, and, you know, I would suggest that this is absolutely the minimum standards in the, is it Housing for Health stuff that the Aboriginal communities have run for a very long time now, that should be revisited at a federal level, and has been kind of dropped a very long time ago now, really.
Great, thanks, Selina. Another question from the audience, which I might alter slightly, is looking at the political sphere. One of the parties seems to have put forward a more serious policy for public housing. Maybe if I could just ask the panel, what are your broad views on the current policy announcements that have been made within the election sphere, and how satisfied are you that our intended political representatives are adequately addressing social, affordable, public and market housing? Or would you prefer not to touch that one?
I don't mind touching it. I mean, I just think it's amazing that the conversation on housing is so absent in this election. I really figured, and I was quite disappointed through the whole COVID time as well, knowing some of the goings on behind the scenes. You know, there was a lot of work done by some great people in state governments to advance conversations with the national government around rental subsidy issues, you know, eviction moratoria, and then extending beyond that to make a great difference that was just ignored. And so, you know, that says something about the fact that the national government just says, well, yeah, okay, we have a role in, you know, the regulation and the overarching framework, but that's it. So investment wise, I'm extremely disappointed. I'm extremely disappointed at the state level here as well. Hence why I was telling you that there's 750 properties coming. So, you know, there's a lot of room for a conversation about building further asset base for Australia in terms of housing. And I get that there's complexity in that. There's supply chain issues. There's a whole range of things that need to be worked through. But where's the vision? You know, we know we've got the highest level of demand that we've had for social housing for a long time, and the stock just, you know, I don't know how many more times we can keep saying what the gap looks like. It's just frustrating.
Okay, thank you, Selina. David?
Yeah, I echo that. Neither of the two parties who have a fighting chance of winning have a policy. But I think that feeds into this mentality in Australia that housing has no constituency. That's a real problem, because of course it does. And I think from my own personal experience, having you know, being Irish and drawing on that context a little bit, what we've seen in 2020 was the third party, Sinn Féin, win the popular vote for the first time since the 1916 kind of aftermath, you know, the uprising. This is a nationalist sort of socialist, not national socialist, sorry, it's a, you know what I mean, it's a socialist party, and they won on a housing platform. Like, that was their entire platform. First and foremost, they addressed the housing crisis and addressed the point that, you know, there's 3 generations of people living under one household now, and we're not a multi-generational culture. You know, they got to the point, and I think that you can demonstrate that you can win, you know, the popular vote if you were to go hard on housing equality. I think that it's just a complete misnomer that we don't have a constituency for housing.
Thanks, David. Andrea, do you want to venture into the psychology at all?
It's just so depressing. There is no debate on housing. That's whether it's market housing. There's certainly no debate on social housing.
The big debate seems to be how high house prices have gone and how far they're going to crash if there is a down. Sadly. Okay. I've got a question about research, but I might leave that till the very last moment and move to a question on what are the panel's thoughts on the social and affordable housing contribution scheme that was recently announced but then withdrawn in Victoria, which required developers of 2 or more dwellings to pay a charge of 1.75% of the value of those properties into a dedicated fund for social housing. Any thoughts?
My only thought is that it was the policy itself was a weak version of inclusionary zoning. The sector has been calling for mandatory inclusionary zoning for some time, and this was a weak version of that. But at the same time, it just kind of showed who is in charge.
Thanks, David. Andrea or Selina? No? Okay.
I'm happy to throw something in, Jago.
Go ahead, Selina.
To what David said, I'm not going to profess to understand what that scheme looked like from the South Australian context, but we do have inclusionary zoning here and have had for quite some time. It probably doesn't deliver as much as it should deliver because there's ways around it. So, you know, when you set benchmarks like 2 properties or 19 properties or 15% or whatever, people just get really creative about making sure they can avoid those kind of benchmarks in delivery. And so it's a regulation and transparency issue, I guess, is what I'm saying too.
Great, thanks, Selina. Good thoughts. Okay, well, we're slightly over our intended finishing time, so I might just put one last question to the panel from Alistair Sisson, which is, thanks everyone. He's interested in the panelists' thoughts on what should be the research agenda, given David's comments, and how can we, as researchers, and all of us are researchers, do research that challenges the policy paradigm rather than reproduces it. Okay, I guess a question that for those of us who've been involved in housing research for a long time are quite familiar with.
Can I just lead off quickly? So,
go ahead, Selina.
And it kind of comes to the consultative infrastructure question a little bit as well. I think it's time within the research domain that we genuinely looked at end-to-end lived experience involvement in our work. And that's hard because our university infrastructures don't necessarily like that particularly, like just in terms of ethics processes and a whole range of other things. But I am involved in a project where we're doing that at a very small scale at the moment. And so I think if you're trying to genuinely get that voice, it can't just be about amplifying that voice or being the expert that's presenting that voice all the time. Like, we genuinely need to look at different ways that we can support and involve that voice from the front end. So it's the sort of genuine co-production of research conversation. It's not easy, and I think David's point about, you know, industry focused research is a really good one. So, you know, there's a bit of kind of checking that we're not constantly reinforcing particular voices all the time, and that we do genuinely involve tenants, you know, end to end. And I think it can be done. I just think that there's a bit of a long burn to make sure that university infrastructures can actually understand what we're trying to achieve as well.
Yeah, Selina, I think that's right. But I think the challenge is not so much the research. I think Australia does quite well in the amount of housing research that's funded. It's research translation, isn't it? It's engagement. How do we go out there? How do we as researchers find all that additional time to make the most of the research we actually do? And to create an agenda whereby the research we think should be done is actually then funded. And that they're enormous challenges for us as individuals within systems that demand
Totally
so
agree.
much.
Absolutely.
And we don't necessarily as researchers ever have those skills built in us either. So I think for 20 years now of working with the Huri, I have said to them, you need to invest in research translators. Like genuinely, there's a specialist skill set there in terms of translation for policy, translation for industry, like there's a whole range of layers of that as well. Totally agree.
David, any last thoughts on that?
Yeah, just I think we need to reimagine who our stakeholders are in the research. You know, if we're doing advocacy-based research, if we're trying to bring about housing equality and housing justice, then we need to look at the people who are actually working towards those ends and produce material for them to use. So this often means that it's people who can afford to pay for the research, it's people who cannot be an in-kind contributor on a linkage grant or whatever. I think we really need to look carefully and sense out who those people are and produce material for them and allow them to roll with it and get on with the job that they're already doing. So, you know, I think that's a privilege actually, but you know, if you can manage it, do it.
Great, thanks very much. Look, I think that's a good point to end on, because we do need to finish up the session, putting the kind of gaze back on ourselves as researchers to make sure that our practices and processes and imperatives are attuned with the needs of social housing clients as much as the regulations and the institutions that they experience in their tenancies. So really good observations from everyone. Okay, well, it's time to wrap up. So I'd like to thank Andrea, David and Selina, and also Hal, who's departed already, for your contributions today. It's been really insightful. I think we had a really good mix of perspectives and covered many of the really key areas in the social housing space really well. Some fantastic conversation and some great questions from the audience across the country. So I'll declare it a successful seminar and thank all who've been involved. I'd also like to recognise some of the support staff at RMIT, Nicole Scott, Joe Jennings, Jenny Lucy and Nicholas Rossi, who, although they're not visible on the screen, are absolutely essential to making this possible today. So thanks everyone. We'll wind up now, and I'm not sure whether we'll be able to put this up as a recording on a website somewhere, but we'll try and send out an alert through some appropriate channel if we do that. So enjoy the rest of your days.